Welcome back again, everybody. So yeah, we're back for another book versus. Today we're looking at The Prince and the Pauper by our old pal Mark Twain. Best known for his role on Star Trek, the guy actually wrote some books along the way, which were then relentlessly remade over and over and over and over. Anyway, for the one person who's not familiar with this story, basically it consists of a prince and a pauper. They accidentally swap places. They're forced to, spend time in each other's shoes, as it were. And in the end, they come out wiser, better for it. Along the way, experiencing different things that range from, happy-go-lucky, sweet things to, oh my goodness, we're all going to die. So out of the many remakes of this particular story, which one is considered to be the best one? Well, according to the internet, it's the 1937 edition, starring ones such as Claude Rains and Errol Flynn. Yeah, we're heading pretty far back in the past with this one, folks, to the age of the old black and white film, nearly a century old at this point. So then, does this supposed classical piece of visual media hold up well, or surpass the original writings? Let's find out first, when moving on to the... So while the original Prince and Pauper book isn't super long by any means, they did have to, of course, cut a lot of it out for the movie, right? The movie did try to make as much of the book as they could into the film. It racked in almost 2 hours, which is a lot longer than I thought it would be. So that all then being said, the first 15 to 20 minutes follows the book actually pretty close. A little bit after that, though, things definitely do start to change. The first thing being the pauper, or Tom, his mother's dead and he has no sisters. This was surprising to me because in the book, very late, like at the end, the climax almost, if you will, it's due to Tom's mother, like him seeing her in the crowd and her reaching out to him and so forth. That's what triggers him to realize what's going on and how he's thinking and how about he's feeling himself. That's what gives him like the case of the conscience. And then that is what enables him to give up the crown when the rightful prince does show up. This one thing changes the entirety pretty dramatically for me personally, and you'll see how apparent that is as we get a little bit further into all this. So the way they get mixed up in the movie is pretty similar to how they do it in the book. So you have the prince, Edward, being wandering off, unknown what to do because he was kicked out by the guards, and then you have Tom, the pauper, wondering what's going on, all anxious, waiting inside the castle for him to return. This forces Tom to figure out how to live as royalty, how they eat, how they talk, how they work, and all that. The movie takes us a completely different direction. So in the book, there is some suspicion that the pauper, Tom, who's constantly saying, hey, listen, I'm not the prince, I'm actually a pauper, actually is just a pauper, not the prince. Not a whole lot comes out of it. They just kind of drop it in the book. But in the movie, the Earl of Hertford, he deduces that, wait, hold on, this guy is telling the truth. He's not actually the prince. He is just a pauper. And the gears start turning pretty fast for him.
Then you know who I am?
Yes.
When can I go home?
Never.
He quickly tricks Tom into giving him a bunch of power and then turns around and threatens Tom with death. Like, hey, listen, if you don't do what I say, I'm going to kill you. There's not a whole lot you can do about it. It's an interesting take on this story. Yeah, I do worry, though, that it might be straying a little bit far away from the original vision and purpose of the story. There's no part of the pauper struggling, to fit in his royalty. There's no about him trying to do the best he can to try to help, the unwashed masses, as it will. That's all regulated to a single scene where Tom refuses to sign a new tax into effect. Seeing like this doesn't make any sense, why should I do this? And he's like, I'll try and figure something else out instead. It almost seems like at the end of the movie when Edward the Prince does come back, the only reason why Tom so readily gives up the crown to him is because, well, he's not a jerk and he doesn't want to spend his entire life in servitude to Hertford. The whole aspect of him getting perhaps, a little bit too comfortable with the finer things in life. There's no true self-examining of himself. That's all gone. This adaptation is entertaining, yes, but I feel that it kind of changes the morals of the story. Meanwhile, the actual Prince Edward, his story is pretty close, sorta, compared to, the movie and the book. Of course, the movie has it short, and that's to be expected, right? Essentially, it takes a lot longer for him to reach the conclusions he does reach in the book, because he has to go through a lot more in the book. And the movie, they relied more on just like a shock value, like, whoa, I can't believe this is actually happening in our kingdom, in order for him to have his change of heart. The outcome is the same in both of them, it's just the way the two medias work. There is a major plot change, though, right? So remember Hertford, he's basically new to the story, well, to this extent. So he actually sends the initial captain who thought Edward was Tom out to go kill Edward because he knows that the real prince is still out there, can come claim the throne. So the poor captain who's being blackmailed to do it because he clearly doesn't want to do it, goes out to kill him. Now, of course, Miles, shows up and saves the guy, but this has some ramifications on the story. First, with only 2 hours to work with, Miles' story is way cut down a lot, right? He's just simply a wandering sword for hire type fellow now. Gone is this backstory about him being a soldier, going off to go fight in battles, with his father and his brother in the manor. That's all gone. His role in the movie is just to simply save Edward and then fight for him. So when Miles does then save Edward from the captain, that's when Miles realizes that, hey, wait a second, this guy who keeps on claiming, I'm the king, actually is the king. Now, this does work for the movie, yes, but I feel it kind of cheapens it because in the book, Miles doesn't realize that Edward is actually the king until he sees Edward as king on the throne, right? So when he sat down in the presence of him in the book was like a really big deal. Hey, what's going on? Unlike in the movie where he seemed to do it more with like, sly grin and kind of like a show-off thing, if anything. Here, I'm just going to quickly read it so you can kind of get an idea what I'm talking about. Miles Hendon was entirely bewildered. There sat the young king under a canopy of state, 5 steps away, with his head bent down and aside, speaking with a sort of human bird of paradise. A duke, maybe. Hendon observed to himself that it was hard enough to be sentenced to death in the full vigor of life without having this particularly public humiliation added. He wished the king would hurry up about it. Some of the gaudy people nearby were becoming pretty offensive. At this moment, the king raised his head slightly, and Hendon caught a good view of his face. The sight nearly took his breath away. He stood gazing at the fair young face, like one transfixed, then presently ejaculated, "Lo, the lord of the kingdom of dreams and shadows on his throne." He muttered some broken sentences, still gazing and marveling, then turned his eyes around and about, scanning the gorgeous throng in the splendid saloon, murmuring, "But these are real. Verily, these are real. Surely it's not a dream." He stared at the king again and thought, is it a dream? Or is he the veritable sovereign of England, and not the friendless poor Tom o' Bedlam I took him for? Who shall solve me this riddle? A sudden idea flashed in his eye, and he strode to the wall, gathered up a chair, brought it back, planted it on the floor, and sat down on it. A buzz of indignation broke out. A rough hand was laid upon him. A voice exclaimed, "Up, thou mannerless clown! Wouldst thou sit in the presence of the king?" The disturbance attracted His Majesty's attention, who stretched forth his hand and cried out, "Touch him not, it is his right." The throng fell back stupefied. The movie's change of content is good. It's entertaining. It's a clever reimagining of the original source material. I'm hesitant to say though it's better because it's missing a couple certain points, but in order to get to that, we'll have to move on to... So going back to Edward again, like I've already said, his story was kind of the same as from the book to the movie, but there was 2 specific things that kind of really bothered me as I was watching it. First is he never gave any examples of his royalty to the commoners who thought he was a commoner at the time in order to show his royalness. So the example I'll have is in the book, right? And that barn scene in the movie, at one point he actually fights a thug via fencing and handily defeats him because, well, he's been properly trained. This really impresses all the commoners and thugs and you're cheering them on. It's just they never had an opportunity to do anything like that in the movie. Another thing is, while he was just as haughty in the book and the movie, respectively, I found that in the movie he's a little bit more emotionally distressed. And the example I want to give of this is, while in the book, he refused to break laws, up to and including them threatening him with violence, right? In the movie, though, he broke almost immediately when they started to talk about agreeing to go in and start stealing for them. Yes, he did save the captain when he saw that the cutthroat was about to kill him, right? But in the book, he wouldn't have gone in even in the first place. Jumping over to Tom, I feel there isn't even really all that much to say about him because he is so overshadowed by Hartford. Aside from his refusing to sign the one tax into law, he didn't really do a whole lot. There were multiple scenes of Hartford trying to, maneuver and try and get more power and money and what have you. Some of those scenes could have been used to try to build Tom up a little bit, but they just didn't bother. This almost made him feel like he's a B character when you compared to how much more screen time other characters had compared to him. Speaking of Hartford, though, he was essentially like a new major character. He fit in very well with the new narrative they did. Same with the captain. They were very well done. I was actually pleased to see they took the time to develop them as characters. They didn't just kind of like shoehorn them in. It's like, no, we're going to take this story in this direction. We have to make sure that the characters work well with it. And they did that, so props for that. Tom's father, he was pretty much spot on with the book and the movie respectively, although I will say he didn't die in the book. He just sort of disappeared at the end. Miles Hendon, he was the most same but different by far when compared to everybody else. They were both skilled fighters, they were both good people at heart, they both saved the prince and took care of him out of curiosity, and because they were just stand-up fellas. But like I mentioned earlier on, his historic was completely removed, so in the book, he has a rusted sword, his clothes are well worn, he doesn't have much money to work with. He's always worried about his father. He's always excited about his betrothed. All that's gone. Instead, what we get is more of like a dashing, heroic figure. It fits great with the movie. And there are parts of his character that are lifted straight from the book. For instance, about how he initially talks to the prince, Edward, and allowing him to sit in his presence in the first place.
Would you sit in the presence of your king?
Now, see here, my
I
lad.
will no longer tolerate your manner.
I ask your pardon, your majesty. But after that chase we led them, it would be good to sit down.
Perhaps. No. Custom must be preserved. You will stand.
Or about how he's interrogating the different shopkeepers in order to find Edward after Tom's father takes him away. He's well done and entertaining in the movie. I'll chop this up to which one do you prefer? Do you prefer the more anxious but trying, book version, or do you prefer the debonair soldier of fortune from the movie? That's all you. Like I said, both are fine by me, but really at the end of the day, it depends on how much you care about the... So making the Pauper more of a hostage situation rather than a fish out of water story really changes the dynamic of the story. Unlike the book, the movie gave us a long-term antagonist to be against. Not just the Pauper's dad, not just the crazed cleric, or some random thug, but no, a proper, rich, intelligent, and powerful adversary to go up against. The book did not have that. Yes, of course there are bad guys in it, but they were hit and miss. They kind of came and went. It was just depending on what arc of the story you're currently reading. This did make for a good movie, but as I insinuated earlier, I'm worried about how it affects the message of the book. Having two kids from polar opposite spectrums of the social ladder being forced to live in each other's shoes. Tom didn't get that. He basically spent the entire time living as Hartford's puppet, and while he did try to resist him a little bit, not that much, and even at the end of the movie, you could see him kind of glancing up at Hartford for direction and what to be doing. Having a definitive bad guy took away Tom's immersion. It took away his reason to self-reflect, to self-examine how he felt about everything. Edward, on his part, yeah, he did speed run, but once again, I understand why they had to do that. It's a 2-hour movie, they can only do so much. The same goes for Miles. I kind of understand why they had to do what they did. The thing though is I can show you how much this affects everything by examining the ending of the movie when compared to the book. Alright, so let's look at the movies. The rightful prince is crowned king, Edward. He offers Miles a bunch of riches. Miles says nuts to that, and he leaves. He then turns to Tom, who's with him now, saying, listen, I'm signing all these new laws, it's going to get rid of slavery and all that stuff. And I'm going to make you my ward. We can play, we're going to be friends, and have fun forever. They laugh. Cue credits. The end. The book goes into way more detail about years, what happened years and years afterwards, and how it affected themselves and how it affected England as a country. That's how much more detail you get out of it. The book wanted to show you how important it was for them switching places. Tom Canty lived to be a very old man, a handsome, white-haired old fellow of grave and benign aspect. As long as he lasted, he was honored, and he was also reverenced, for his striking and peculiar costume kept the people reminded that in his time he had been royal. So whenever he appeared, the crowd fell apart, making way for him and whispering one to another, "Doff thy hat, it is the king's ward." And so they saluted, and got his kindly smile in return, and they valued it too, for this is an honorable history. Yes, King Edward VI lived only a few years, poor boy, but he lived them worthily. More than once when some great dignitary, some gilded vassal of the crown, made argument about his leniency, and urged that some law which he was bent on amending was gentle enough for its purpose, and wrought no suffering or oppression which anyone need mightily mind, the young king turned with the mournful eloquence with his great compassionate eyes upon him and answered, "What dost thou know of suffering and oppression? I and my people know, but not thou." I get it, the movie is already 2 hours long, they couldn't have this big long epilogue, but all they had to do to fix this, or change this, was simply add a text overlay. And I can say this, right, because they did this not once but twice during the movie. Just have a text overlay explaining what happened to everybody afterwards. So after all that being said, which one is the better media? The original book or the 1937 movie? Is it the self-introspective tale from the book or the heroic swashbuckling adventure of the movie? Well, I'll say both were definitely fun and entertaining in their own right, but if I really had to choose one being better than the other one, I would have to say it's got to be the book. I just feel that Mr. Twain's original vision makes the better story, or impact on storytelling, or moral building. Don't get me wrong, the movie was good stuff. I thoroughly enjoyed watching it, and if you simply refuse to read for one reason or another, give the movie a watch, you will like it. But if you're a reader like me, you better stick with the book. Thanks for watching. Miles Hendon and Tom Canty were favorites of the king, and through his brief reign and his sincere mourners when he died, the good Earl of Kent had too much sense to abuse his peculiar privilege, but he exercised it twice after the instance we have seen it before he was called from this world. Once at the accession of Queen Mary, and once at the accession of Queen Elizabeth. A descendant of his exercised it at the accession of James I. Before this one son chose to use a privilege, near a quarter of a century had elapsed, and the privilege of the Kents had faded out of most people's memories. So when the Kent of that day appeared before Charles I in his court and sat down in the sovereign's presence to assert his perpetual the right of his house, there was a fine stir indeed, but the matter was soon explained and the right confirmed. The last Earl of the line fell in the wars of the Commonwealth, fighting for the king, and the odd privilege ended with him.